Oscar Wilde writes in the preface to his 1891 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, as a moral or immoral book. While his motivation for this addition to the novel version of the story likely had more to do with the legal trouble he was experiencing than his actual views on the matter, I would argue that The Picture of Dorian Gray is neither moral nor immoral, but does contain morality. In fact, the first thing Wilde does is locate us in the archetypal morality story, The Fall of Man. The first two chapters of the novel take place in a variation on the Garden of Eden, the studio gardens of the painter Basil Hallward. Basil, the resident Adam, is conversing here with Lord Henry I, the Satan figure, concerning the titular Dorian Gray, Eve. As the exposition progresses, Wilde's moments of adherence and diversion from the canon establish his own characteristics in these classic roles, while setting them up to undergo novel circumstances as relevant to the trends of the decadence and the way it conflicts with the societal standards of the Victorian period. The Garden of Eden imagery is made evident even after the first sentence. Quote, "The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amongst the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn." End quote. The first thing the reader is made aware of is the proximity of the studio to the garden, and the sights and smells someone in the room would experience. This is a distinctly mimetic beginning to an otherwise romantic and decadent book. Wilde prioritizes locating us in this place, despite the fact that Basil's studio and garden is not returned to after this opening scene. This location is significant to the exposition of the novel, but not for the remainder of it. The Garden of Eden is paradise, but the novel relies on Dorian's ability to live in the world, and to experience for experience's sake. Thus, Basil's studio and garden cannot be returned to later in the story, for the finishing of the portrait marks the beginning of Dorian's awareness of himself. Dorian Gray is cast as Eve before he has even had a chance to speak, when Basil and Lord Henry have their initial conversation about him. Upon viewing the mostly completed portrait, Lord Henry says of Dorian, quote, "He is some brainless, beautiful creature, who should always be here in winter when we have no flowers to look at, and always here in summer when we want something to chill our intelligence." End quote. Lord Henry hasn't even met Dorian yet, and he is already determined to see him merely as a decoration, not the typical view one would hold of a wealthy young man in the 1890s. This also sets a precedent for the reader, who has not yet met Dorian Gray either, to think of him as a personified work of art, not a real person. When the reader does finally meet Dorian through Lord Henry's eyes, he is described as, quote, "wonderfully handsome, with his finely curved scarlet lips, his frank blue eyes, his crisp golden hair," end quote. This attention to the lips, the descriptors of choice being finely curved and scarlet, create a sensual, soft image typically reserved for the female form, as is the focus on the eyes and hair as opposed to jawline, build, or any of the other stereotypical indicators of masculine beauty. Beyond the purely physical descriptors, there is also, quote, "something in his face that made one trust him at once. All the candor of youth was there, as well as all youth's passionate purity. One felt that he had kept himself unspotted from the world," end quote. This emphasis on youth and purity is also usually most valued in women, and more importantly, isn't mentioned at all when it comes to the descriptions of Basil or Lord Henry. They are both older and clearly more experienced, but that experience isn't presented as a facet of their value the same way it is for Dorian, the way it would be for a woman. Besides the feminization of Dorian, his relationship with Basil is presented in a manner which suggests an Adam to his Eve. One of the many instances of Basil expressing his devotion to Dorian is when Lord Henry asks him how often he sees Dorian, to which he replies, quote, "every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. He is absolutely necessary to me," end quote. This clearly goes beyond the typical painter and model relationship, and even friendship, entering into a place of deep romantic connection. However, Basil's attraction to Dorian is always described through the lens of art, which lends it a purity that mimics Adam and Eve's romance, sexual and yet free of sin. This admission of their constant association and presence in his studio paradise to work on the portrait, only then to be invaded by Lord Henry, also contributes to this narrative, for it was only after Satan slithered his way into the garden to meet Eve that the fall of man began. Amongst the many declarations of his strong feelings for Dorian, Basil admits that he has an investment in a part of Dorian that surpasses even the typical romantic relationship, the portrait. When it is suggested to Basil that he display his painting, he declines, declaring, quote, "I have put too much of myself into it," end quote. Adam gave up a rib to create Eve, and Basil gave up a part of himself to create the portrait, which proves to be a true extension of Dorian's self. This is one interesting departure from the Garden of Eden casting. Where does the portrait fall? It is undoubtedly connected to Dorian's person, and yet it remains physically separate from him. When Dorian saw the completed portrait, he, quote, "drew back, and his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure. A look of joy came into his eyes as if he had recognized himself for the first time. The sense of his own beauty came on him like a revelation." End quote. This is the reflection moment, when Eve is first made aware of herself through her reflection in the water. Wilde seizes on this moment and turns the reflection into a character of its own, and puts it in a form that is expected to remain constant, as opposed to a literal reflection, which is expected to change over time. An additional departure from the original narrative is the horror and sadness Dorian feels, realizing he will one day be old and no longer beautiful as he is now. Eve is merely enamored with herself and newfound personhood, also leaving her open to the influence of nefarious beings. Dorian Gray's snake in the garden takes the form of Lord Henry. From the beginning, Basil is incredibly concerned about what would happen if Lord Henry were to meet Dorian, such as that he flat out tells him, quote, "I don't want you to meet him," end quote. And when it is unavoidable, Basil pleads with Lord Henry not to, quote, "spoil him." Basil is wholly aware that Lord Henry's influence is dangerous, and is desperate not to expose Dorian to it, so that he might not be led to ruin. This is also a departure from the Garden of Eden picture, in that the Adam and Satan figures have a relationship, and Adam is aware of the possible consequences for Eve if Satan were to be introduced. Additionally, Basil doesn't follow Dorian into sin the same way Adam follows Eve, and it seems the bulk of Basil's sin lay in his past. He is introduced for the first time as, quote, Basil Hallward, whose sudden disappearance some years ago caused, at the time, such public excitement and gave rise to so many strange conjectures, end quote, only for this disappearance never to be referenced again. Assuming the sin in question is homosexuality, and taking into account the apparent feelings that Basil has for Dorian, it follows that he would want to protect him from the possibility of ostracization by keeping him ignorant. As Basil feared, Dorian remains unaware of this love as a possibility only until Lord Henry, the snake, presents himself with the apple of knowledge in the story, the little yellow book. Lord Henry thinks of the book upon his first meeting Dorian, and well before he actually gives it to him. After speaking for only a moment or two, the perilous habit of denying one's impulses, he finds himself, quote, amazed at the sudden impression that his words had produced, and remembering a book that he had read when he was 16, a book which had revealed to him much that he had not known before, he wondered whether Dorian Gray was passing through a similar experience, end quote. Herein also lies a brief moment of humanity for Lord Henry, and possibly even some sympathy for what may be a similarity between them. It's possible that he diverges from his role as the Satan figure in thinking this, and that his motivation for thinking of the book to begin with is that he genuinely believes it will help Dorian through the uncertainty of his youth. However, it could also be argued that he thinks of Dorian merely as a pretty toy for him to shape into whatever he wants. Either of these two motivations may be giving Lord Henry entirely too much credit as to his morality or to his intelligence, and it is most likely that he didn't think much about the idea at all and simply acted on impulse, in which case he exhibits the unrestrained wish fulfillment of Satan, if not the intelligence or scheming. In Basil and Lord Henry's initial conversation about Dorian in the garden, there is a moment in which Lord Henry picks a flower, only to later, quote, pull the daisy to bits with his long, nervous fingers, end quote. This is a mild act by and large, but it serves to position Lord Henry in opposition with Dorian at the beginning of the story insofar as his morality. When Dorian is presented with the same situation, Lord Henry finds him, quote, burying his face in the great cool lilac blossoms, feverishly drinking in their perfume as if it had been wine, end quote. Before he has been exposed to Lord Henry's influence, Dorian doesn't pick the flowers, but appreciates their aroma without destruction. Flowers are a symbol for purity, innocence, and virginity, so for Lord Henry to pick one, play with it for a little, and then destroy it is apropos when considering the result of his later relationship with Dorian. The references Wilde makes to the Garden of Eden in the opening of the picture of Dorian Gray provide not only an engaging introduction, but offer the reader a model to compare the characters against as the story progresses. Wilde locates us in these classic roles to then show us a speculative version of the fall of man, what might have happened had Eve embraced Satan's influence wholly, and lived her life not in repentance for her sins, but reveling in them. He explores the truly decadent idea of living uninhibited by concern for morality and convention, free to care only for oneself. But this parallel was not merely a thought experiment, nor was it wholly a cautionary tale about the evils of morality. Wilde's variation on the Adam and Eve narrative offers a representation of the so-called fall that the young gay man experienced in the 1890s. He begins innocent of the nature of his feelings until he encounters a Lord Henry to make things clear for him. From there, he can either become a victim, as Basil does, as do the many young men Dorian drives to ruin, or the hunter. In both cases, it isn't actions that spell doom, but the knowledge of one's true desire.